a millionaire gave a single mom a ride to the hospital. What she revealed about her children left him shaking. And before we continue, make sure to subscribe to our channel for more gripping stories like this. Enjoy the story. The city was alive with chaos as rain lashed against the windshield of a sleek black limousine weaving through heavy traffic. Inside, Robert Grant sat with an air of restless authority. His sharp navy suit was flawless, his shoes gleamed, and his watch, a limited edition Patek Philippe, caught the dim light with every impatient tap of his fingers. Robert had always been a man in control. At 48, he was the epitome of success, a self-made millionaire who had clawed his way to the top with unrelenting ambition. Yet, tonight, control seemed to slip through his fingers. The downpour had turned a simple drive to an exclusive charity gala into an agonizing crawl. The frustration was evident on his face as he scrolled through emails on his phone, dismissing most with an irritated flick of his finger. The limousine slowed to a stop at a red light, the driver murmuring an apology about the worsening traffic. Robert barely acknowledged him, muttering under his breath, "This city falls apart at the first sign of rain." Then, a blur of movement caught his eye. A woman darted into the street, her soaked figure illuminated by the headlights. She waved her arms desperately, shouting something inaudible over the roar of the rain. "Good God," Robert muttered, sitting upright. "What now?" The driver glanced back, unsure of what to do. "Should I?" Before he could finish, Robert lowered the window just enough to let the woman's voice cut through the storm. "Please, I need help," she cried, her voice trembling with panic. "My son, he's in the hospital. I can't find a cab." Robert hesitated, his sharp eyes scanning her face. She was drenched, her brown hair clinging to her pale cheeks. The desperation in her eyes was unmistakable, but he had learned to be wary of strangers and their stories. People often saw his wealth as an invitation to take advantage. Yet, there was something raw and undeniable in her plea. He sighed, running a hand through his neatly combed hair. "Get in," he said, gesturing to the driver to unlock the door. The woman hesitated for a split second, then climbed in, clutching a worn purse against her chest. Rainwater pooled beneath her as she sat, her breathing ragged. "Thank you," she murmured, barely audible. Robert studied her for a moment before speaking. "Where's the hospital?" "St. Matthew's downtown," she replied quickly, wiping her wet face with trembling hands. "My son, he's only 8. He can't breathe properly. I was supposed to be there hours ago." But her voice broke, and she shook her head, her words dissolving into sobs. The driver glanced at Robert through the rearview mirror, awaiting instructions. Robert gave a curt nod. "Take us there, quickly." As the limousine sped through rain-slick streets, the woman tried to steady her breath. She glanced at Robert, her eyes brimming with gratitude and exhaustion. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to intrude like this." "You didn't have much of a choice," Robert replied, his tone clipped but not unkind. "What's your name?" "Claire," she said softly. "Claire Thompson." He nodded. "I'm Robert Grant." Her eyes widened slightly at the name. "You're the businessman, aren't you? The one on the news with all the charities." Robert leaned back in his seat, his expression unreadable. "Something like that." Silence fell between them, broken only by the sound of the rain and the hum of the car. Claire shifted uncomfortably, glancing down at her soaked clothes. "I didn't know who else to turn to," she admitted, her voice trembling. "It's just me and Ethan, my son. His father. He's not in the picture. And the medical bills." She stopped herself, shaking her head. "I shouldn't burden you with this." Robert frowned slightly, his curiosity piqued. "What's wrong with him?" Claire hesitated, then answered, her voice barely above a whisper. "He has a rare condition. It affects his lungs. The doctors say it's genetic, but Her voice trailed off as tears welled in her eyes. "I've done everything I can, but it's never enough. Every time he has a crisis, it feels like..." She broke off, clutching her purse tightly. Robert remained silent, his sharp mind dissecting her words. There was an honesty in her voice that he couldn't ignore, a rawness that struck a chord he didn't expect. As they neared the hospital, Claire's composure began to crack. She leaned forward, gripping the edge of her seat. "Please hurry," she urged the driver, her voice edged with panic. "We're almost there," Robert said, his tone steady. The car pulled up to the emergency entrance, its headlights cutting through the gloom. Claire bolted from the car before it had fully stopped, dashing into the hospital with frantic energy. Robert hesitated for a moment, then followed, his polished shoes clicking against the wet pavement. Inside, the fluorescent lights of the hospital illuminated Claire as she approached the reception desk, explaining Ethan's condition with breathless urgency. Robert hung back, observing her from a distance. The chaos of a hospital felt oddly familiar to him. It stirred memories he hadn't touched in years, of long nights in waiting rooms and whispered prayers for outcomes that were never certain. As Claire was led to the pediatric wing, Robert followed, his steps deliberate. He told himself he was merely ensuring she was safely delivered to her destination. Yet, as he watched her kneel beside Ethan's bed, whispering softly to the pale, fragile boy, he felt something shift within him. There was a strength in Claire that he couldn't ignore, a relentless determination that reminded him of someone he used to be, or someone he had lost along the way. As he turned to leave, Claire's voice stopped him. "Thank you, Mr. Grant," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I don't know how to repay you." Robert glanced back, his expression inscrutable. "You don't need to," he said simply. But even as he spoke the words, he felt an unfamiliar weight settle in his chest. Something about Claire and Ethan felt unfinished. Something told him his involvement had only just begun. The sterile brightness of the hospital hallway contrasted starkly with the turmoil in Claire's expression. As a nurse wheeled Ethan into the pediatric unit, Claire hovered by his side, her hand lightly brushing his arm. Her son's small body looked even frailier under the harsh fluorescent lights, and every shallow breath he took seemed to tighten the invisible grip of fear around her chest. Robert Grant lingered a few steps behind, his polished shoes making soft, deliberate clicks against the tiled floor. He told himself he was only staying out of curiosity, a fleeting obligation to ensure Claire and her son were safe. But the longer he watched her, the harder it became to turn away. A nurse approached Claire, handing her a clipboard filled with forms. "We'll need you to fill these out while we run some initial tests," she said, her voice professional yet tinged with sympathy. Claire nodded, clutching the clipboard as if it were a lifeline. As the nurse guided Ethan into a treatment room, Claire's shoulders sagged, the weight of the moment nearly crushing her. She turned to Robert, who stood against the wall, his arms crossed and his expression unreadable. "You don't have to stay," she said softly. "You've already done more than enough." Robert studied her for a moment, noting the exhaustion etched into her face, the faint tremor in her hands. "I'll stay," he said finally, his voice firm but not unkind. "Just until I know he's stable." Claire's eyes glistened with gratitude. She nodded and sank into a chair by the wall, the clipboard resting on her lap. Minutes stretched into an hour as Claire filled out the forms with painstaking care. Robert sat across from her, his phone forgotten in his pocket. For once, the constant stream of emails, calls, and demands from his business felt irrelevant. His attention was fixed on Claire, on the way she tucked a strand of damp hair behind her ear, the way her lips pressed into a thin line when she hesitated over a question. "You've been through this before," Robert observed, breaking the silence. Claire looked up, startled by his voice. "What?" He gestured toward the forms. "You've done this before. The way you're answering those questions, It's like second nature. Claire gave a tired smile, her pen pausing mid-sentence. I've lost count of how many times I've filled out these forms. Every hospital, every doctor's office, it's always the same questions, the same answers. But every time, it feels harder. Like admitting he's sick makes it more real. Robert nodded, his gaze steady. How long has he been sick? Claire hesitated, her eyes drifting toward the closed door of Ethan's room. Since he was 4, she said quietly. It started with a persistent cough. At first, they thought it was asthma. But the tests, they kept finding things that didn't add up. Eventually, they diagnosed him with a rare genetic condition that affects his lungs. Her voice wavered as she spoke, the weight of the past for years pressing down on her. They said there's no cure, just treatments to manage the symptoms. I've done everything I can, sold our house, worked 3 jobs, but it's never enough. Every time I think we're ahead, something else happens. Another hospital stay, another bill. She trailed off, her fingers gripping the clipboard tightly. Sometimes I don't know how much more I can take, but I have to keep going. For Ethan. Robert leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. What about his father? He asked cautiously. Claire's expression darkened, a flicker of pain crossing her face. He left when I told him I was pregnant, she said flatly. Said he wasn't ready to be a dad. I haven't seen or heard from him since. Robert's jaw tightened, a surge of anger rising within him. He had little patience for people who shirked their responsibilities, especially when a child was involved. So you've been doing this alone, he said, more as a statement than a question. Claire nodded, her lips curving into a bitter smile. It's funny. People always say, I don't know how you do it, as if there's another choice. You just do what you have to, even when it feels impossible. For the first time in years, Robert found himself at a loss for words. He had faced countless challenges in his life. Ruthless competitors, high-stakes deals, economic downturns, but he couldn't imagine the kind of strength it took to face what Claire had endured. The door to Ethan's room opened, and a doctor stepped out, his expression neutral but professional. Claire immediately stood, her heart pounding. How is he? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He's stable for now, the doctor said. We've administered medication to help with his breathing, but we'll need to run more tests to understand the severity of his current condition. Claire nodded quickly, relief washing over her even as her anxiety lingered. Can I see him? The doctor gestured toward the room. Of course. But he'll need rest, and we'll update you once we have more information. Claire turned to Robert, her eyes soft with gratitude. Thank you for staying. You didn't have to, but it means a lot. Robert rose from his seat, his gaze steady. Go be with your son. I'll wait out here. Claire hesitated, then nodded, disappearing into Ethan's room. Left alone, Robert sat back down, his thoughts swirling. He told himself he had done enough, that he had fulfilled his moral obligation by helping a stranger in need. Yet, deep down, he knew this wasn't the end. Something about Claire's story, her resilience, her unwavering love for her son, stirred a part of him he had long buried. As the hours passed, Robert found himself replaying the details of their conversation, piecing together fragments of her life. He couldn't explain why, but he felt drawn to her struggle, compelled to do more than just observe from the sidelines. When Claire finally emerged from Ethan's room, her eyes red but her posture steadier, she found Robert still sitting there, waiting. She paused, her lips curving into a faint smile. You stayed? Robert nodded. I said I would. For the first time, Claire allowed herself to relax, the weight of her burdens feeling just a little lighter. And for the first time, Robert felt the stirrings of something he hadn't expected, purpose. Robert leaned against the wall of the hospital corridor, his arms crossed, and his thoughts tangled in a web of emotions. Claire had returned to Ethan's room after speaking briefly with the doctor, her presence soft but fierce, like a shield of love between her son and the harshness of the world. Watching her, Robert felt a mixture of admiration and discomfort. He had spent years insulating himself from other people's struggles, focusing on the controlled chaos of his empire. Yet, here he was, drawn into a story that felt far too personal. The muffled hum of hospital activity filled the air, nurses calling out orders, distant beeping monitors, the shuffle of hurried footsteps. Robert's phone buzzed in his pocket, a reminder of the world he had momentarily left behind. He glanced at the screen, emails from his assistant, updates on projects, a missed call from a board member. All urgent, all irrelevant in this moment. Damn it, he muttered under his breath, silencing the device and slipping it back into his pocket. As he shifted his gaze, the door to Ethan's room opened, and Claire stepped out. Her face was pale, her eyes heavy with exhaustion, but there was a flicker of relief in her expression. "He's asleep," she said quietly, approaching Robert. "The medicine helped." Robert nodded, his voice steady. "Good. That's good." Claire leaned against the wall beside him, folding her arms tightly. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind that allowed thoughts to settle and emotions to breathe. Finally, Claire broke it. "Why are you still here?" she asked, her tone soft but curious. "You don't owe us anything. Most people would have left hours ago." Robert hesitated, his gaze fixed on a scuff mark on the floor. "Maybe I should have," he admitted. "But something about your story, about Ethan, it hit closer to home than I expected." Claire tilted her head, studying him. "Closer to home? How so?" He took a deep breath, the words coming slower than he intended. "When I was younger, my family wasn't exactly stable. My father worked himself to death, trying to keep food on the table and a roof over our heads. My mother spent most of her time taking care of my younger brother, Michael." His voice faltered slightly at the name, but he pushed through. "Michael had a lot of problems, health issues, behavioral stuff. He always needed more attention, and my parents gave it to him. I learned early on that if I wanted anything, I had to get it myself." Claire listened intently, her expression softening as she pieced together fragments of his past. "What happened to Michael?" she asked gently. Robert's jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing as he stared at the floor. "He disappeared," he said after a pause. "He got mixed up with the wrong crowd, drugs, gambling, you name it. I tried to help him, but he didn't want it. He left years ago. No calls, no letters. Just gone." The rawness in his voice caught Claire off guard. For a man who exuded power and control, this vulnerability was unexpected. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "That must have been hard." Robert gave a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "Hard, sure, but you get used to it. You build walls. Focus on what you can control. That's how I built my business, by keeping those walls up." Claire nodded, her gaze thoughtful. "Until now." Robert glanced at her, his brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" She shrugged lightly, a small smile playing at her lips. "You're still here, aren't you? Maybe those walls aren't as solid as you think." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a nurse, who handed Claire a fresh set of forms. "These are for Ethan's next round of tests," the nurse explained. "We'll need them completed before tomorrow morning." Claire nodded, thanking the nurse before turning back to Robert. She sighed, the weight of responsibility settling over her again. "Another mountain of paperwork," she said, attempting a weak laugh. Robert straightened, his businessman instincts kicking in. "Let me help." Claire blinked, taken aback. You don't have to." "I know," he interrupted, his tone firm but kind. "But you've been carrying this on your own for too long. Let me lighten the load, even if it's just paperwork." She hesitated, then handed him a portion of the forms. "Okay," she said softly. "Thank you." They found a quiet corner in the waiting area and began working through the documents. As they filled in the blanks, Claire explained the nuances of Ethan's condition, the endless tests, the specialists, the treatments that offered little more than temporary relief. Robert listened intently, his mind racing with ideas and possibilities. "Have you ever considered seeking care outside the city?" he asked at one point. "A specialist with more experience in rare conditions." Claire sighed, setting her pen down. "I've thought about it. There's a clinic in Boston that's doing groundbreaking work with kids like Ethan. But the cost..." Her voice trailed off, and she shook her head. "It's impossible. I'd never be able to afford it." Robert frowned, his mind already calculating. He knew the kind of resources required for top-tier medical care. He also knew he had the means to make it happen. "What if cost wasn't an issue?" he asked, his voice careful but deliberate. Claire looked up at him, her eyes wide with a mix of hope and disbelief. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I can help," Robert replied simply. "I can cover the expenses. Get Ethan to that clinic, make sure he gets the care he needs." Her breath hitched, tears welling in her eyes. "Robert, I don't even know what to say." "Say yes," he said, his voice steady. "Let me help." For a moment, Claire said nothing, her emotions too overwhelming for words. Then she nodded, her voice breaking as she whispered, "Yes, thank you." Later that night, as Claire returned to Ethan's room to check on him, Robert remained in the waiting area, his thoughts swirling. The decision he had just made felt monumental, but it also felt right. For years, he had built his life around profit and power, distancing himself from the pain of his past. But now, for the first time, he felt like he was doing something meaningful. As he stared out the window at the rain-soaked city, a quiet resolve settled over him. He didn't know where this journey would lead, but he was determined to see it through. The morning sun filtered through the hospital blinds, casting soft streaks of light across the waiting area where Robert sat, sipping a lukewarm coffee. He hadn't slept much, but the weariness that crept into his body was matched by a strange sense of resolve. He'd made a decision, a monumental one, that tied him to the lives of two people he'd known for less than a day. And yet, it felt inevitable, as if some unseen force had been steering him toward this moment. Across the room, Claire walked out of Ethan's room, her steps slow but purposeful. Her eyes carried the weight of exhaustion, but there was something lighter in her expression, a faint glimmer of hope that hadn't been there before. She spotted Robert and smiled faintly, her gratitude evident without needing words. "You're still here," she said softly, sitting down in the chair beside him. Robert set the coffee cup down on the small table, leaning forward slightly. "I told you I would be." Claire exhaled, her shoulders sagging. "I can't believe you're doing this. The clinic in Boston, the specialists, it's more than I could have ever hoped for." Robert nodded, his expression thoughtful. "It's the right thing to do. Ethan deserves a chance. And so do you?" She looked down at her hands, twisting her fingers nervously. "It's just, no one's ever done something like this for us. I'm not used to accepting help." "Maybe it's time you did," Robert replied gently. "You've carried this burden on your own for too long. Let someone else shoulder some of it." The sound of approaching footsteps interrupted their conversation. A nurse appeared, holding a clipboard and offering a polite smile. "Good morning, Miss Thompson. The doctor wants to run a few more tests on Ethan before we finalize the transfer." "It shouldn't take long." Claire nodded, standing quickly. "Of course. I'll go with him." The nurse hesitated, glancing at Robert. "Actually, we'll only need you to fill out some additional paperwork. You can stay here for now." Claire hesitated, looking conflicted. Robert stood, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Go ahead," he said. "I'll wait here and make some calls. We've got a lot to organize for Boston." She offered him a grateful smile before following the nurse down the hallway. Left alone, Robert retrieved his phone and began making arrangements. His assistant was efficient, already coordinating with the clinic in Boston and arranging for a private transport. As he spoke, his tone was decisive, his mind focused on logistics. But beneath the surface, a swirl of emotions churned. This wasn't just about logistics or charity. It was personal in a way that Robert hadn't fully admitted to himself. Ethan's condition, Claire's determination, even their struggles, it all mirrored fragments of his own past. And now, the decision to help them felt less like an act of generosity and more like an obligation to confront something he had spent years avoiding. By the time Claire returned, her face pale but calm, Robert had finalized most of the arrangements. She sank into the chair beside him, letting out a slow breath. Ethan's resting. They're prepping him for the move. Everything's set, Robert said, slipping his phone back into his pocket. We'll leave for Boston this afternoon. A private jet will take us directly there. Claire blinked, her surprise evident. A private jet? Robert, I don't even know what to say. Don't say anything, he replied firmly. Just focus on Ethan. Her lips parted, as if to protest, but she stopped herself. Instead, she nodded, her voice soft. Thank you. For everything. The afternoon came quickly, and the hospital buzzed with activity as the transfer process began. Ethan was carefully wheeled out on a stretcher, his small frame swaddled in blankets. Claire stayed by his side, her hand never leaving his. Robert followed closely, his presence a steady reassurance. As they exited the hospital, the cold air hit them, sharp and bracing. A sleek black car waited at the curb, ready to take them to the airport. The ride to the airstrip was quiet, the hum of the engine lulling Ethan into a light sleep. Claire sat beside him, her hand gently stroking his hair. Robert watched from across the seat, his thoughts distant. Do you fly often? Claire asked suddenly, breaking the silence. Robert glanced at her, a small smile tugging at his lips. More than I'd like. It comes with the job. She nodded, her gaze thoughtful. I've never been on a plane. Ethan always wanted to, though. He loves the idea of flying, seeing the world from above. Robert's smile deepened, a flicker of warmth in his expression. He'll get his chance. Boston will be the first of many trips for him. Claire looked at him, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. You say that so confidently, like you believe it. I do, Robert said simply. The jet was waiting on the tarmac, its engines humming softly. Claire hesitated as they approached, her nerves evident. Robert placed a hand on her back, guiding her gently. It's safe, he assured her, and fast. Ethan will be in Boston before you know it. Once on board, the cabin was quiet and comfortable, a stark contrast to the chaos of the hospital. Ethan rested peacefully in a reclining seat, while Claire sat beside him, holding his hand. Robert took the seat across from them, his gaze shifting between the boy and his mother. As the plane ascended, Claire leaned back, closing her eyes for a moment. Robert watched her, noting the way her shoulders finally relaxed, the way her breathing steadied. She had been carrying an impossible weight for years, and now, for the first time, it seemed like she could let go, just a little. When she opened her eyes, she found Robert looking at her. What? She asked, a faint smile playing at her lips. Nothing, he said, shaking his head. Just thinking. About what? He hesitated, then spoke honestly. About how much strength it takes to do what you've done, to fight for Ethan the way you have. Her smile faltered, replaced by a look of vulnerability. You do what you have to. When it's your child, there's nothing you wouldn't do. Robert nodded slowly, her words resonating deeply. I get that, he said quietly. The rest of the flight passed in companionable silence, the weight of their shared purpose binding them together. When the plane finally touched down in Boston, the first steps of a new chapter awaited. As they disembarked, Robert glanced at Claire and Ethan, a quiet determination settling over him. This wasn't just about offering help. It was about building something more. A bond. A family. The cold air of Boston wrapped around them like a silent promise of change. The city was bustling, its streets alive with purpose as cars honked and pedestrians hurried about. The hospital where Ethan was to receive his treatment loomed ahead, a sleek, modern building of glass and steel that reflected the overcast sky. Robert stepped out of the car first, his commanding presence seeming to quiet the chaos around them. He turned to help Claire, who was holding Ethan's hand. The boy was bundled in a thick blanket, his small face pale but curious as he looked around. "This is it," Robert said, his voice steady. "The best pediatric specialists in the country are waiting for him." Claire nodded, her eyes darting between Ethan and the hospital. She squeezed her son's hand gently, leaning down to whisper, "You're going to be okay, sweetheart. We're in good hands now." Ethan gave her a faint smile, his eyelids heavy with exhaustion. Robert watched the exchange, his chest tightening. There was something about the boy's quiet strength that reminded him of someone he used to be, a part of himself he thought he'd left behind. Inside the hospital, they were greeted by a team of doctors and nurses. Their professionalism was evident, but so was their warmth. One of the doctors, a tall woman with kind eyes, introduced herself as Dr. Peterson. "Welcome to Boston Children's Hospital," she said, her tone calm and reassuring. "We've reviewed Ethan's case, and we're optimistic about his treatment plan. If you'll follow me, we'll get started right away." Claire clung to every word, her relief palpable. "Thank you," she said, her voice trembling. "Thank you for giving us this chance." Dr. Peterson nodded with a soft smile. "We'll do everything we can." As they walked through the brightly lit halls, Claire stayed close to Ethan's side, while Robert followed a step behind, observing everything. The state-of-the-art facilities, the compassionate staff. It was clear that this was a place where miracles happened. And yet, Robert couldn't shake the nagging doubt in his mind. If it wasn't enough, they reached a private room prepared for Ethan, where nurses began setting up equipment. Claire helped Ethan settle into the bed, her hands gentle but steady. Robert stood by the door, his phone in hand as he coordinated with his assistant about logistics for their extended stay in Boston. When he finally looked up, he caught Claire watching him. Her expression was soft, almost grateful. "You don't have to stay here, you know," she said. "You've already done so much." Robert slipped his phone into his pocket, meeting her gaze. "I'm not going anywhere," he said firmly. "Not until we know he's out of the woods." Claire's lips quivered with the beginnings of a smile. "You're a good man, Robert. I know you probably don't hear that enough, but you are." He blinked, caught off guard by her words. "I'm just doing what needs to be done," he replied, his tone gruff. But Claire shook her head. "No, it's more than that. You didn't have to help us. Most people wouldn't have." Robert looked away, his jaw tightening. "Let's just focus on Ethan," he said, changing the subject. Over the next few days, Ethan underwent a series of tests and evaluations. The medical team worked tirelessly, their dedication evident in every action. Claire stayed by Ethan's side, her presence unwavering. Robert divided his time between the hospital and his makeshift office in a nearby hotel suite, ensuring that every detail of Ethan's care was handled while juggling the demands of his business. Late one evening, Robert returned to the hospital to find Claire sitting alone in the waiting area outside Ethan's room. She was cradling a cup of coffee, her eyes fixed on a spot in the distance. He approached quietly, taking the seat beside her. "You should be resting," he said. Claire smiled faintly, shaking her head. "I can't. Every time I close my eyes, I see all the times I almost lost him. It's like my brain won't let me stop worrying." Robert nodded, understanding more than he cared to admit. "Worrying won't help him," he said, his voice low. "But being here, showing him you're strong, that will." Claire turned to him, her gaze searching. How did you get so good at this? At knowing the right thing to say. He hesitated, his usual composure faltering. I've had my share of mistakes, he admitted. More than I'd like to count. Maybe helping you and Ethan is my way of making up for some of them. Claire reached out, placing a hand on his arm. You don't have to make up for anything, Robert. What you're doing now, it's enough. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of Ethan's laughter drifting from his room. It was faint, but it was there, and it pulled them both to their feet. They peeked inside to see a nurse showing Ethan a magic trick with a deck of cards. The boy's eyes sparkled with genuine joy, a sight that brought tears to Claire's eyes. Robert felt a lump form in his throat. In that moment, he realized just how much he had grown to care, not just about Ethan's survival, but about his happiness, his future. As they stood there, side by side, Claire turned to Robert and said, I don't know what's ahead, but I feel like, for the first time in a long time, we have a chance. And that's because of you. Robert looked at her, his expression softening. It's not just me, he said. It's you. It's Ethan. You've both been fighting this battle long before I came along. I'm just here to help you win it. The night stretched on, but neither Robert nor Claire felt the weight of exhaustion as they watched over Ethan. In the quiet of the hospital room, a bond began to form, one built not on obligation, but on shared purpose and unspoken understanding. For the first time in years, Robert felt like he was exactly where he needed to be. The morning sun poured through the hospital room window, casting a warm glow over Ethan as he slept. Claire sat by his side, her hand resting gently on his arm, her eyes fixed on the soft rise and fall of his chest. For the first time in days, Ethan's breathing was steady, and a faint blush had returned to his cheeks. Claire allowed herself a small moment of relief, though worry lingered like a shadow in the corner of her mind. Robert stood in the hallway, his phone pressed to his ear as he spoke with his assistant. His tone was calm but firm, a sharp contrast to the chaos he had managed since arriving in Boston. Yes, I'll need another week, he said, and reschedule the investor call for next month. Make it happen. He ended the call and slipped the phone into his pocket, leaning against the wall as he exhaled deeply. The weight of the situation was pressing down on him, but it wasn't just the logistics or the financial commitments. It was something deeper, something he hadn't been able to put into words. When Claire stepped out of the room, her eyes found his, and she gave him a tired but grateful smile. He's stable, she said softly. The doctors are optimistic. That's good, Robert replied, his voice steady. It's a step in the right direction. Claire nodded, her gaze lingering on him. You look like you've barely slept. Robert gave a wry smile. I could say the same about you. She chuckled softly, though the sound carried a hint of exhaustion. Fair enough. I guess neither of us are very good at taking breaks. Some things are more important, Robert said simply. They made their way to the hospital cafeteria, where the hum of quiet conversations filled the air. Claire stirred her coffee absently, her thoughts clearly elsewhere. Robert watched her for a moment before breaking the silence. You're thinking about him, he said. Claire looked up, startled. About Ethan? No, Robert said, his voice lower now. About his father. Her expression faltered, a mixture of sadness and frustration washing over her. She set her coffee cup down, her hands trembling slightly. I try not to, she admitted, but sometimes I can't help it. I think about what it would have been like if he'd stayed, if he'd been a part of Ethan's life. Maybe things would have been different. Robert frowned, leaning forward. Do you really believe that? She hesitated, then shook her head. No. He made his choice, and I've made mine. Ethan's better off without someone who couldn't be there for him. But it still hurts, knowing that someone could walk away so easily. Robert's jaw tightened, his thoughts drifting to his own family. I know exactly what you mean, he said, his voice quiet but firm. My brother, Michael. He left a trail of chaos everywhere he went. I tried to help him, tried to give him chances, but he never took them. And when he finally disappeared, I told myself it was for the best. But there's always that nagging voice in the back of your head, wondering if you could have done more. Claire studied him, her expression softening. You carry a lot of guilt, don't you? He looked away, his lips pressing into a thin line. Maybe. But guilt doesn't fix anything. It doesn't bring people back. Their conversation was interrupted by the sudden buzz of Robert's phone. He glanced at the screen, his brow furrowing at the unfamiliar number. He hesitated for a moment before answering. "Robert Grant," he said curtly. The voice on the other end froze him in place. "Robert, it's me." He gripped the phone tighter, his breath catching. "Michael," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Claire's eyes widened as she watched his expression shift from shock to anger. "Where the hell have you been?" Robert demanded, his tone sharp now. "Do you have any idea?" "Listen to me," Michael interrupted, his voice rough but urgent. "I don't have much time. I know about Ethan. I know everything." Robert's blood ran cold. "What are you talking about? How do you know about Ethan's?" There was a pause on the other end of the line before Michael spoke again, his voice cracking. "Because I've been watching. And because there's something you need to know." Robert's heart pounded as he clenched his free hand into a fist. "What is it?" he asked through gritted teeth. "It's about Ethan," Michael said. He's not my son." The words hit Robert like a freight train, leaving him momentarily speechless. "What are you talking about?" he finally managed. Claire said. "I know what she said," Michael cut in, "but she doesn't know the truth. I didn't tell her, because I didn't think I deserved to. I thought I could step in and make it right, but I was wrong. And now, it's up to you." Robert's mind raced as he tried to process the revelation. "You're telling me Ethan's my son?" "Yes," Michael said, his voice heavy with regret. "I should have told you years ago, but I was a coward. I thought I could protect you both by staying out of it, but I only made things worse." The line went dead before Robert could respond. He lowered the phone slowly, his hand trembling as he stared at it. Claire's voice broke through the fog in his mind. "What is it? What's wrong?" Robert looked up at her, his expression a mixture of disbelief and pain. "That was Michael," he said quietly. "He's alive." Claire gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "What? But how?" "He didn't explain," Robert said, his voice tense. "But he said something that changes everything. He said, Ethan's my son." The color drained from Claire's face as she took a step back, her legs threatening to give way beneath her. "That's not possible," she whispered. "Michael was the only one." Robert shook his head, his gaze steady. "He said he knew. He said he kept it from you. From me." "Claire, if this is true..." She sank into a chair, her head in her hands. "I don't understand. Why would he lie? Why would he let me believe?" "Because that's who he was," Robert said bitterly. "He thought he was doing the right thing, but he only made everything worse." Tears streamed down Claire's face as she looked up at him. "What do we do now?" Robert hesitated, his thoughts a chaotic swirl. But as he looked at Claire at the doorway to Ethan's room, a sense of clarity began to form. "We find out the truth," he said firmly. "And whatever it is, we face it. Together." The air in the hospital corridor felt heavier after the revelation, as if the weight of the truth had seeped into the walls themselves. Claire sat frozen, her face pale, and her hands trembling in her lap. Across from her, Robert stood motionless, his broad shoulders stiff, his expression caught between disbelief and determination. "I can't," Claire whispered, shaking her head. "How could he? How could Michael keep something like this from me? From you?" Robert exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair. "It's who he was," he said, his voice low, but edged with bitterness. "Michael always thought he knew better, always acted like he could control everything. But this..." He trailed off, his fists clenching at his sides. "This is different." Claire stood abruptly, her hands balling into fists. "I gave everything I had for Ethan, believing Michael was his father. I thought I knew the truth. But now," her voice broke, and tears streaked her face. "Now, I don't know what to think." Robert stepped closer, his voice softening. "Claire, none of this changes what you've done for Ethan. You've been his whole world. That doesn't change because of Michael's lies." Her shoulders sagged as she sank back into her chair, wiping her eyes. "But what about Ethan?" she asked, her voice trembling. "What happens if he finds out? How do we explain this to him?" Robert crouched in front of her, meeting her gaze. "We tell him the truth. When the time is right, we tell him everything. But right now, what matters is getting him through this. He needs us, Claire. Both of us." The conversation left them both shaken, but there was no time to dwell on the shock. Ethan's treatment was progressing, and the doctors needed decisions about the next steps. Claire threw herself into the details, asking endless questions and ensuring every option was explored. Robert, meanwhile, worked quietly in the background, coordinating logistics and ensuring no resource was spared. That evening, after hours spent with doctors and nurses, Claire and Robert found themselves alone in the hospital's quiet lounge. The room was dimly lit, with soft chairs arranged around low tables. Claire sat with her hands wrapped around a cup of tea, her expression distant. "Do you think he's telling the truth?" she asked suddenly, breaking the silence. Robert, who had been staring at the darkened window, turned to her. "Michael." He hesitated before answering. "Yes. As much as I hate to admit it, I think he's telling the truth. It adds up, the timing, the details." Claire nodded slowly, her gaze dropping to her tea. "And what about you? How do you feel about all of this?" He let out a humorless laugh, leaning back in his chair. "How do I feel? Like the ground just shifted under my feet. Like everything I thought I knew about my family, about my life, has been turned upside down. But more than that," he paused, his jaw tightening. "I feel responsible. If Ethan is my son, then I've already wasted too much time not being there for him." Claire looked up, her eyes soft with understanding. "You didn't know, Robert. You can't blame yourself for something you didn't know." "Maybe not," he admitted, "but I can make up for it now." Their conversation was interrupted by the buzz of Robert's phone. He glanced at the screen and frowned. It was another unknown number. His stomach tightened as he answered. "Robert Grant." The voice on the other end was Michael's, strained but unmistakable. "We need to talk," he said. "We already did," Robert snapped, his voice low but sharp. "And you dropped a bombshell on me before disappearing again. What the hell do you want now?" Michael sighed heavily. "I need to explain. Not just to you, but to Claire." Robert glanced at Claire, who was watching him with a mix of curiosity and apprehension. "She's here," he said. "You want to explain? Start talking." "No," Michael said firmly. "Not over the phone. Meet me. Tonight. There's a coffee shop 2 blocks from the hospital. Midnight." "Why should I trust you?" Robert asked, his voice cold. "Because I'm your brother," Michael replied. "And because you need to hear the whole story." Before Robert could respond, the line went dead. He lowered the phone slowly, his thoughts racing. Claire leaned forward. "Was that Michael?" Robert nodded, his jaw tightening. "He wants to meet. Tonight." She hesitated, then nodded. "You should go." "Not without you," Robert said firmly. "You deserve answers as much as I do." The coffee shop was nearly empty when they arrived. The faint smell of espresso lingered in the air, mingling with the hum of soft jazz playing from a hidden speaker. Michael was seated at a corner table, his head bowed as he fidgeted with a napkin. When he looked up, his face was pale, his eyes hollow. Robert and Claire approached cautiously, their expressions guarded. Michael gestured to the empty seats across from him. "Thanks for coming," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Cut the pleasantries, Robert said, his tone icy. Start talking. Michael flinched but nodded. I deserve that. He took a deep breath, his hands trembling slightly. Claire, when you came to me all those years ago, I thought I could fix everything. I thought I could be the man you needed, even though I knew Ethan wasn't mine. Claire's eyes widened, her breath catching. Why didn't you tell me the truth? Because I didn't want to lose you, Michael admitted, his voice cracking. I thought if I stepped up, I could be part of your life, part of Ethan's life. But I wasn't good enough. I never was. Robert's fists clenched on the table. And you thought lying was the answer? You let Claire struggle all these years, thinking you were the father. I know I screwed up, Michael said, his voice desperate. But I thought I was protecting you both. And when things got too messy, when I couldn't handle the pressure anymore, I left. I thought you'd be better off without me. Claire's eyes filled with tears, her voice trembling. You had no right to make that decision for me. For Ethan. Michael hung his head, his guilt palpable. I know, and I'm sorry. But I'm here now, trying to make it right. Robert leaned forward, his voice low and dangerous. Making it right starts with the truth. No more lies, no more excuses. Is Ethan my son's? Michael met his gaze, his own eyes glistening with unshed tears. Yes, he's yours. The words settled over the table like a thunderclap, leaving a stunned silence in their wake. Robert exhaled sharply, his emotions a chaotic swirl of anger, regret, and determination. Claire wiped her eyes, her voice soft but resolute. You've caused so much pain, Michael. But if what you're saying is true, then Robert and I will handle this. Together. Michael nodded, his expression a mixture of sorrow and relief. I just hope you can forgive me someday. Robert stood, his posture rigid. Forgiveness isn't a priority right now. Ethan is. He turned to Claire, his voice steady. Let's go. As they left the coffee shop, the weight of the truth hung heavy between them. But for the first time, Robert felt a sense of clarity. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but he was ready to face it, because now he knew exactly what he was fighting for. The morning air in Boston was crisp and invigorating, yet heavy with the unspoken weight of the night before. Claire sat at the edge of Ethan's hospital bed, gently brushing his hair back as he slept. His small face looked peaceful, free of the strain that had shadowed it for so long. But Claire's thoughts were far from peaceful. The revelations from their meeting with Michael lingered like a storm cloud, leaving her unsure of how to move forward. Robert stood near the window, staring out at the bustling city below. His suit jacket hung loosely over a chair, his sleeves rolled up, a rare glimpse of the man beneath the polished exterior. He seemed lost in thought, his expression unreadable. Finally, Claire broke the silence. What happens now? She asked, her voice soft but steady. Robert turned to her, his gaze steady but laced with determination. Now we focus on Ethan. He's the priority. Claire nodded, her hand resting lightly on her son's. But what about the truth? Do we tell him? And if we do, when? Robert hesitated, his jaw tightening. He had spent the night wrestling with the same questions, and the answers still felt elusive. He's too young to understand right now, he said carefully. But one day, when he's older and stronger, we'll tell him everything. Together. Claire looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and uncertainty. Do you really think he'll be okay? After all this. Robert crossed the room, his footsteps deliberate, and placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. Ethan's stronger than either of us realizes, he said. And he's not alone anymore. He has you. He has me. We'll make sure he's okay. The day passed in a blur of medical updates and quiet moments. The doctors were pleased with Ethan's progress and optimistic about his response to the treatment plan. Every bit of good news felt like a small victory, a glimmer of hope breaking through the fog of uncertainty. In the afternoon, Claire stepped out to grab some fresh air, leaving Robert alone with Ethan. The boy stirred awake, his large eyes blinking up at Robert in confusion. "Hey, buddy," Robert said, his voice softer than usual. He pulled up a chair and sat beside the bed. "How are you feeling?" Ethan shrugged, his small shoulders barely moving. "Tired," he murmured. Robert smiled faintly. "That's okay. You've been through a lot, but you're doing great." Ethan studied him for a moment, his young face filled with curiosity. "Are you my mom's friend?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Robert hesitated, caught off guard by the question. "I guess you could say that," he replied. "I'm here to help. For both of you." Ethan nodded slowly, his eyes drifting shut again. Robert watched him for a moment longer, a strange sense of protectiveness settling over him. He had spent most of his life avoiding emotional entanglements, keeping people at arm's length. But Ethan was different. Ethan was his son, whether the boy knew it yet or not. That evening, Claire and Robert sat together in the hospital cafeteria, the hum of quiet conversations filling the space. Claire toyed with her cup of tea, her gaze distant. "I keep thinking about Michael," she said suddenly, "about how much damage his lies caused. But at the same time, I don't know if I would have had the strength to do this without him. He gave me hope, even if it was built on a lie." Robert leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "Michael made a lot of mistakes," he said, "but I think, in his own twisted way, he wanted to protect you. He just didn't know how." Claire looked at him, her eyes searching his face. "Do you think he'll ever come back?" "For Ethan?" Robert shook his head, his jaw tightening. "I don't know. But if he does, it'll be on our terms. Ethan deserves stability, not more chaos." Claire nodded, her shoulders relaxing slightly. "You're right. He's been through enough." The following day, Ethan's doctors delivered the best news yet. His body was responding well to the initial treatments, and his condition was stabilizing. The relief in Claire's eyes was almost overwhelming, her tears falling freely as she hugged the doctors and nurses who had made it possible. Robert stood nearby, his arms crossed but his expression soft. For the first time in years, he felt like he was part of something bigger than himself, something meaningful. Later, as they sat with Ethan, Claire turned to Robert and said, "I don't know how to thank you for everything." Robert looked at her, his gaze steady. "You don't have to thank me, Claire. This isn't about gratitude. It's about doing what's right." She smiled, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "You're a good man, Robert. No matter what you tell yourself, you are." As the days turned into weeks, a new rhythm emerged. Ethan grew stronger, his laughter returning in small bursts that filled the room with light. Claire and Robert worked together seamlessly, their shared purpose binding them in ways neither had expected. One afternoon, as they sat in the hospital garden watching Ethan play with a nurse, Claire turned to Robert. "Do you ever wonder what it would have been like if things had been different?" Robert frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" "If Michael had told the truth from the beginning," she said. "If you'd known Ethan was your son all along." Robert was quiet for a moment, his gaze fixed on Ethan. "I think about it every day," he admitted. "But the past is the past. What matters now is the future. And I'm not going to waste another second." Claire nodded, a soft smile playing at her lips. "Neither am I." That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the city in a warm golden glow, Claire and Robert stood by Ethan's bed, watching him sleep. The weight of everything they had been through felt distant now, replaced by a quiet sense of hope. "Do you think he knows?" Claire asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Robert shook his head. "Not yet, but he'll figure out one day. And when he does, we'll be ready." She reached out, her fingers brushing against his. "Thank you, Robert, for staying, for fighting with us." He looked at her, his expression softening. "There's nowhere else I'd rather be." As they stood there, Side by side, the future no longer felt uncertain. Together, they had faced the truth, and together, they would build something new, something strong, a family. And now, I want to hear from you. Which part of this story touched your heart the most? Leave a comment and share your thoughts. And of course, if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more narratives like this. Each subscription helps us continue bringing exciting stories to you. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.